So let's talk about the three methods of prepping cream soup. Obviously, which do you think is the least common method in today's professional kitchen, and why? Now, I just said it, and that's why I kind of stumbled. But when we talk about cream and everything we've talked about in this class, it kind of gave you a little bit of a hint, I guess, there. So let's talk about cream soups. So we have a couple of different methods by which we can make these. So cream soups were once simply diluted veloutés or bechamel sauces, and they were flavored with ingredients for which they were named. So this is the first method. Now, obviously, a couple of you guys made velouté and bechamel sauces, and I'm not sure who made the bechamel, but I'm sure that you may have had some problems making it, obviously making sure it didn't curdle, making sure that it wasn't chunky, and it was a little bit labor intensive. Our method 2 of how you can make these is typically you sweat the vegetables in butter, then you add a little bit of flour to form a roux that we discussed earlier. Then you would add stock, cook the vegetables through, and then potentially you might pass them through a food mill or a food processor, and typically you would finish them with cream. So that's a little bit different than method 1. And finally, method 3, you would simmer the vegetables in the stock, you would make a roux, and then you would beat the roux into the soup while it was simmering, and potentially after that you could pass it through a food mill or a food processor, and then finish off with the cream. So which of these do you think is least likely to be used in a restaurant right now? It's definitely method 1, just because not many restaurants nowadays make bechamel sauces or velouté sauces and just keep them on hand to use in further cooking. They typically would be using something like a method 2 or a method 3 in order to make one. Standards of quality for cream soups, obviously the thickness. We want to make sure that it has a nice thickness, consistency of kind of like a heavy cream or something along those lines. It's definitely something that we want to make sure it's hearty in a sense. The texture has to be very smooth, no graininess, no lumps. Graininess is typically when you don't actually cook the roux all the way through, so that's when you actually can taste a little bit of the flour. That's what we call graininess. And then finally, the taste. We want to have a distinct flavor of the main ingredients, not just the butter or the cream. So if you are making a mushroom cream sauce, the cream should be balancing out or complementing the mushroom flavors. It shouldn't be the other way around. How would you prevent a cream soup from curdling? So there's a couple of ways to do this. One of the biggest ones that we look at, and one of the biggest things that we always say is whenever you're adding some sort of cream or cold milk, make sure that it is not cold when you add it to the simmering soup. You cannot add hot and cold together because it will typically break. So we need to make sure that you are adding the cream, you actually bring it to a closer temperature than the liquid that you will be adding it to. That is a big one. Also, we don't want to boil soups after the milk or cream is added. This will also force it to separate. So immediately after you add the cream or milk, you want to make sure that you turn the heat off as well. Let's talk a little bit about puree soups. Now, puree soups are very, very popular right now. Why? Because we're actually thickening soup, so we're creating the illusion of a thick, hearty soup, but we are not adding the actual additional calories, such as the cream and addition of butter or even flour. So typically what you do is you start off by sweating the onions or a mirepoix, which you remember mirepoix is onions, but also carrots and celery. And you could also add some other fresh vegetables, and typically we sweat this in fat. So it could be a butter if you want, or it could be some sort of oil. After that, we add stock or another liquid. Now, obviously you would add stock, either beef or chicken if you were making a non-vegetarian soup. If you are making a vegetarian soup, you need to make sure that you're either adding water or a vegetable stock. After that, you will add some sort of starchy vegetable. That is very important. So here in this picture, we are adding split peas, but we can use lentils or beans. Those are ones that are typically used. Something that has a starchiness to it, potatoes, that will help thicken the soup. And then finally, you puree the soup with typically an immersion blender, depending on how large your soup is, or a food processor or a food mill. It just depends on how much control you want over the actual puree. So with an immersion blender like what's being used in the picture, you have way more control over how chunky or non-chunky you want the soup. If you're putting it into food processor, typically you are fine with having that be very, very runny. All right, so what do we typically do with soups in a restaurant? So we typically have some sort of a soup cycle, to where you might design this as your soup cycle, part of your menu, and it's something that kind of helps your guests know what the soup is every single time when they come in. It also helps with prep. A lot of times soups are actually better the next day, sometimes even 2 days out. So it's a good idea to prep them way ahead of time, so before we actually serve them. So this is just an example of something that you actually might have. And common question in restaurants nowadays, what's the most commonly used stock? And it is chicken. So chicken, that is definitely the most common stock that people make nowadays in restaurants. If they do make any type of stock, it's definitely going to be chicken.